Welcome back to LawNewz Network. I'm Heather Hansen here with my next guest who is going to talk to us about a whole host of things legal. We're going to be speaking about the opioid epidemic and various people who may be held criminally responsible for some of that, and also about non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs. We've heard a lot of them over the past few weeks when it comes to Harvey Weinstein and some of the cases at Fox, and we're going to get into some specifics. So I'd like to welcome Marni Snyder. She is a criminal defense attorney out of Philadelphia. Good afternoon, Marni.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Marni, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to start because I know you have handled some cases as a criminal defense attorney with regard to what we often call pill mills. And given the issues that we've been having of late with opioids and all the talk about the opioid epidemic, I wanted to talk to you about that. Last week, John KAPOOR was arrested and arraigned. He is the head of Insys Therapeutics, which made a spray-on fentanyl product. And he is entering a plea because he allegedly bribed doctors to prescribe his product, thus leading to people to become addicted to that particular opioid. What investigations involving this epidemic, where do you think those investigations are going to go?
Well, I think that it looks as though the U.S. Attorney's Office and prosecutors are becoming more and more interested in using laws like bribery, racketeering, and also false advertising claims, as we saw with the tobacco industry in the past. And so they're going to be going after people at all different levels of the opioid epidemic. And that's because many people on the street, where we've been combating crime so far, are victims themselves of the epidemic that really became a bigger deal in 2000 when people kind of realized that they could misuse the product as it was put out there, and also kind of realized that the times that the manufacturer were putting on the product as far as slow release weren't always accurate and led to addiction.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that we're going to be seeing more and more of the manufacturers being investigated. I know that there's a lot of talk about the people who have marketed these drugs and the way that they've been marketing these drugs. One of the things that we saw with KAPOOR that I thought was particularly interesting is the claim that he and other members of his company were actually bribing doctors to use the drug more often. Do you think that we're going to see doctors brought in as criminal defendants for having accepted those bribes and having further sort of perpetuated this this huge epidemic on a huge swath of America?
I do. I think that that's another place for prosecution to go. I think it might be harder to show that those people took part, or that the bribe affected how they might treat their patients. Because if doctors are doing legitimate treating of people's pain and chronic pain, which is certainly an important part of medicine, then they're going to have a good defense to even having that attempt to bribe them. So we're going to be looking at medical records, whether the medication was necessary and appropriate for that person. The prosecutions might not want to delve deep into those things, though, because it is people's privacy and legitimate patients. So we're going to have to see whether it's egregious enough for the U.S. attorney to bring those people into court.
What do you think? I mean, you know, with KAPOOR's situation, I think that he's going to be entering a plea next month, at least according to reports that I've seen. Does he really have a choice? I mean, if there's enough documentation of bribery, what type of defense would one attempt in a case like this?
Well, obviously I shouldn't say obviously. The indictment has been sealed, and I haven't been able to see every single allegation against him, and there could be many reasons why that's happening. We're going to have to kind of find out whether those allegations are that he was participating in meetings with larger corporations, medical facilities, or whether he's going to be able to claim that he didn't have knowledge of each and every individual bribe that was happening. And so really it's going to be knowledge-based. It's going to be whether there was a system of doing these bribes, whether there was an advertising claim that was telling doctors that they could come to them and they would get a certain kind of kickback. So we really have to see what his involvement is from a knowledge perspective. And also how far-reaching this was, because that's part of how they prove knowledge, is whether this had been going on for a long period of time how it had been communicated, and really what those bribes were.
Well, and that far-reaching piece also sort of implicates our other questions as to who else may be investigated or have charges brought against them. If it's as far-reaching as it seems to perhaps have been, we may see some more charges come from that particular set of circumstances.
Right. Well, the indictment includes racketeering, which might be an indication that the prosecution is leaving itself open to bring more people into the case.
Good point. I wanted to talk to you as well about non-disclosure agreements. This is something that I spent a lot of time reading up on over the weekend, because I saw yet last week when people were talking about the non-disclosure agreement between Bill O'Reilly and Lee Sweal, a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of conversation about these non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs. And a lot of times, just to sort of take a step back for our audience, a lot of times what happens is in these cases, a woman accuses someone of either sexual assault or sexual harassment. They settle that case, they resolve it, and as part of the resolution, the woman signs an NDA saying that they will not publicize the facts of their allegations or the facts of the settlement. I'm sure, Marni, that this is something that you've seen in your practice?
Yes.
So now the question has become whether or not these NDAs are actually standing in the way of prosecuting sexual assault predators, people who go out and do this again and again. And there's been some question. In fact, a California legislator by the name of Leyva has tried to pass a law to ban these provisions, saying that they endanger the public because it hides these predators who can then go on to do it to other women. What's your sense of that? Do you think that's an appropriate law, and how would that work?
Well, first, it assumes that all of these people that engage in something that they then get sued for are predators, right? So it presupposes that it is in the interest of the public to be protected from this person. But we also need to think about the fact that a contract on its face is considered to have been bargained for, meaning that both people entered that contract having thought about what they were giving to the contract, what they were giving up, and where it could go. And that's really what a settlement agreement is. Now, obviously, someone who is in a position where they've been the victim of either assaultive behavior or harassment, we would think of them as coming from a place of victimhood, but I don't think that that's always fair. I think we should be looking at whether that person was represented by an attorney, how far removed from the assault or harassment they are when they enter that agreement. And so when you pass a law, you're then saying, you're giving a more blanket statement. All agreements or all victims might not have had the bargaining power when they got to the table. Really, if we don't pass a law like that and allow the courts to look at each non-disclosure agreement as it reaches the courts, either by someone violating or someone, bringing that into a courtroom or a criminal courtroom and litigation surrounding that, then we can examine those things. So I happen to think that we should allow people to kind of enter contracts as they come and encourage them to have competent representation when they enter those contracts. And also, I care very much about victims' rights, and I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I do think that it's something that has certainly caused a lot of these stories to remain quiet and remain secret for many years. But I think also in some respects that has benefited the women who entered into those agreements. They oftentimes don't want to talk about it, and to have been paid for or negotiated something that makes them feel like they've been compensated in some small way and not have to go out and publicly speak is certainly something that can be to their benefit as well. So I agree with you, to pass a law on this to make them illegal across the board may be overreaching by no small steps.
Right. I would rather see victims, most often women, empowered in regards to laws making the workplace a fair place, or being empowered by really teaching men about rape culture, rather than being empowered by saying you can no longer have this term in your contract because we're going to force you into the light.
Well,
I don't think that helps women or any victim.
Agree with you 100%, and empowered enough to be willing to talk about it. And I think that's one of, if every cloud has a silver lining, then one of the silver linings of everything that has come forward, especially with Weinstein, and now it's coming forward this week about Mark Halperin. I mean, we continue to just hear more and more, but with everything that comes forward, we see that more and more women are willing to speak out and willing to discuss. And in fact, we saw Zelda Perkins, who was one of Harvey Weinstein's assistants, actually broke her non-disclosure agreement to come forward and tell her story. Now that can be dangerous, right? I mean, there's repercussions legally for having done that, correct?
Yes. I mean, they might have anticipated that if there's a breach of that non-disclosure agreement, then a certain thing will happen, or they might now be litigating, whatever the claim is by Mr. Weinstein.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that particular case, Weinstein probably won't pursue any sort of action against her, given all of the allegations against him. But for other women, you don't want to go around just breaking non-disclosure agreements. A lot of times, the person with whom you've signed that can file for an injunction to make you abide by the agreement, and can get monetary damages, some of the money back, for having broken the agreement. So it's certainly something that, if you're ever in this situation, ladies and gentlemen at home, you want to make sure that you're negotiating the non-disclosure agreement, that you have legal representation, and that you think really long and hard about whether or not this is something that you're going to want to remain silent about for the rest of your life. Because, to Marni's point, it is not always in the best interest to be remaining silent. Do you think, Marni, that we're going to see fewer and fewer of these non-disclosure agreements as women become more and more empowered?
I think it's a possibility, but I also think that having a non-disclosure agreement actually can give a victim bargaining power, because you're trying to entice the person into this agreement to try to make you whole. And so, like I said, this negotiation is coming from both sides. If I'm a victim trying to negotiate a settlement, and that settlement's not going to be confidential, it might not be in that person's interest to give me a damage claim, a damage reward as high now in my settlement, because that person's thinking about how their reputation might be harmed down the road, and is it worth it? I could be drug into court. I might not get any real closure from the case unless I go to authorities and do it their way. So having less non-disclosure agreements by law takes it out of my hand. But we might see a trend in that way as women become more empowered to speak, and that's a positive change in the culture. Well, I just don't want to see that as much on the law side if it really limits the capability of victims to negotiate their own settlement.
Yeah, and I think that's correct. And also, I think it needs to be noted that if there's a non-disclosure agreement, but the police find out about a situation outside of the information in that NDA, there are legal ways to ensure that that case can go forward, and oftentimes the person who signed the NDA can be asked and forced to testify. So it's not as if this is completely ruining the chances of any sort of criminal prosecution. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, it's harder for law enforcement to find out about. It obviously creates some tension between prosecution and their witnesses. But yeah, if there's an independent reason for law enforcement to believe that a crime has been committed, they can pursue that and use their discretion in doing so. I think we're going to see some issues between prosecutors and civil attorneys coming into the courtroom and saying, hey, but this was what we all agreed to. Kind of stay away from us. This is what they want.
Well, and that makes it hard for us lawyers, right? Because these are the types of things that, like them or not, that we have to be able to rely upon in negotiating something to protect our clients.
Right. And during that process now, we're going to have a lot of people, when they think about non-disclosure agreements, wanting to put in certain penalties into contracts and things like that, because they're never going to feel sure. And I think before, if this does become a trend, before this trend, it was a closure for both victim and for the accused. And now there's going to be, some uncertainty to that, and that has to be included in the agreement and bargained for.
I agree 100%. Marni, thank you so much for being with us and addressing these two very different topics, but topics that I know that you handle in your practice. Again, this is Marni Snyder. We'll be sure to have you back again, Marni, and thank you so much for your time today.